My husband brought his mistress into our home, wrapped an arm around her waist, and smirked as if he had already won. Her family is in a league you'll never reach. Know your place. I smiled, took a sip of wine, and sent my father a 2-word text. Pull funding. 3 minutes later, my husband's phone rang. The color drained from his face before he even answered. People often assume secrets are complicated things hidden behind lies, forged documents, and elaborate stories. Mine wasn't. I simply never told my husband who my father really was. That was it. When I met Alistair Thorne 12 years earlier, I was 23, fresh out of postgraduate studies and determined to build a life that belonged to me instead of my family's name. My father, Reginald Sterling, had spent decades building one of the most respected financial investment groups in the country. His company didn't own high street banks, but it financed major projects, backed expansions, and held enough influence that executives listened whenever he spoke. I wanted none of that, at least not publicly. I wanted to know whether people liked me because of who I was or because of what my surname could do for them. So, when I met Alistair at a charity fundraiser in London, I introduced myself simply as Cordelia Sterling. No titles, no explanations, no family history, just Cordelia. At the time, Alistair seemed different. He was ambitious but charming, confident without being arrogant and attentive in a way that made me feel seen. He worked as a junior manager at a regional building society and talked constantly about his goals. He wanted to become an executive one day. He wanted respect. He wanted success. I admired that. Looking back, I realize I admired the version of him that existed before success became the only thing he cared about. The first warning came from my father. It came only 3 months after Alistair and I started dating. We were having dinner at my father's country house in the Cotswolds. Alistair thought my father was simply a wealthy, retired businessman. Dad never corrected him. After Alistair left that evening, my father poured himself another glass of single malt scotch and stared out at the water. "He likes power too much," he said. I laughed. That's a strange criticism for a businessman. My father shook his head. No, ambition isn't the problem. The problem is that he measures people by what they can do for him. I remember rolling my eyes. You've met him twice. Twice was enough. At the time, I thought my father was being overly protective. Today, I know he was being observant. Over the years, Alistair climbed steadily through the banking world. Promotions came, bonuses grew, better bespoke suits appeared in the wardrobe. Expensive watches found their way onto his wrist. The higher he climbed, the more he changed. At first, it was subtle. He became impatient with waiters, dismissive toward service workers, obsessed with status. Then, it became harder to ignore. He constantly compared people who earned more, who lived in a better postcode, who had stronger connections, who belonged in the room, and who didn't. Unfortunately, I increasingly fell into the second category, not because of anything I had done. Because Alistair genuinely believed I came from a modest background. I worked as a consultant and lived comfortably, but I never flaunted money. I drove a practical estate car. I wore simple clothes. I preferred quiet weekends over exclusive social events. To Alistair, simplicity eventually became evidence of inferiority. The comments started small. "You wouldn't understand how these people think, or this is how wealthy families operate." Every time he said something like that, I wondered whether telling him the truth would change anything. Then I decided it shouldn't have to. If respect depended on my family name, it wasn't respect at all. About 4 years into our marriage, my father tried one last time to warn me. We were walking through the city of London after lunch. He stopped at a zebra crossing and looked directly at me. "Cordelia, if that man ever crosses a line you can't forgive, I want you to remember something." I frowned. "What?" "You don't have to endure it." "Dad, no. Listen." His voice was calm. "If the day ever comes when you need me, send me those 2 words. I already knew which 2 words he meant. Pull funding. The phrase wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about business. It was a signal, a message, a way of saying I've exhausted every other option. I laughed it off at the time. "Dad, I'll never send that." He smiled sadly. "I hope you never do." For years, I didn't. Even when Alistair started staying later at work, even when his phone became permanently attached to his hand, even when conversations between us became shorter and colder, I kept hoping things would improve. People don't leave marriages at the first sign of trouble. At least I didn't. You remember the good years. You remember promises. You remember who someone used to be. And sometimes you hold on to those memories long after they've stopped being real. The first time I seriously suspected an affair was 6 months before everything collapsed. Alistair had started mentioning a woman named Genevieve. Always casually, always professionally. At least that's what he claimed. Genevieve worked in private wealth management. Genevieve was smart. Genevieve had excellent connections. Genevieve came from a prominent family. Genevieve this, Genevieve that. Eventually, I stopped asking, partly because I already knew the answer, partly because I wasn't ready to hear it. Then came the Thursday evening that changed everything. I arrived home from work just after 6 o'clock. The house was unusually loud. Music drifted from the dining room. Laughter followed. For a moment, I thought Alistair had invited clients over. Then I walked inside and saw her, Genevieve. She sat comfortably at my dining table, drinking wine from one of my crystal glasses. Alistair stood behind her. His hand rested possessively on her shoulder. Neither of them looked surprised to see me. That was the worst part. Not guilt, not panic, not embarrassment, confidence. They expected me to accept it. Alistair smiled. The same smile I had once fallen in love with. Only now it looked completely different. Cold, condescending, cruel, Cordelia, he said casually. You're home early. I set down my handbag. Neither of us mentioned that it was my house, too. Genevieve looked me up and down. Then she smiled. I knew that smile. Every woman does. Alistair stepped closer to her almost protectively. Then he delivered the sentence that would destroy his entire life. Genevieve's family is in a league you'll never reach. He smirked. Know your place. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The room became perfectly still, and suddenly something inside me settled. Not anger, not heartbreak, acceptance. I looked at Alistair and realized my father had been right all along. This wasn't the man I married. Maybe he never had been. Slowly, I picked up my wine glass, took a sip, set it back down. Then I reached for my phone. Alistair laughed. He genuinely thought I was texting a friend. Maybe he thought I was about to cry. Maybe he thought I was powerless. Instead, I opened a conversation that hadn't been used in years. My father's name appeared on the screen. I typed 2 words, pull funding. Then I hit send. 3 minutes later, Alistair's phone started ringing. He glanced at the screen, and for the first time that evening, his smile disappeared. Alistair stared at his mobile as it vibrated in his hand. For a moment, he didn't answer. The confidence that had filled the room only seconds earlier seemed to vanish. His eyes remained fixed on the caller ID, and I noticed something I hadn't seen in years. Uncertainty. Genevieve leaned toward him. Who is it? Alistair swallowed. It's Julian Vance, the CEO. Even Genevieve recognized the name. Her smile disappeared immediately. Nobody ignored a direct call from the CEO of a major banking firm at 7 o'clock in the evening. Alistair quickly answered, Sir. His voice sounded completely different now. Respectful, nervous, the way employees sound when speaking to someone who controls their future. I quietly picked up my wine glass again and sat down at the table. I had no idea exactly what my father was doing, but I knew him. Reginald Sterling never acted recklessly. If he had responded to my message, he had done so for a reason, and he had certainly done it carefully. Alistair listened silently for several seconds. Then he frowned. Tomorrow morning, more silence. His expression grew increasingly tense. I understand. Pause. Yes, sir. Another pause. Then something changed. The color drained from his face. His eyes widened. Not dramatically, not like in a film. It was subtler than that. The kind of reaction people have when a piece of information suddenly rearranges their understanding of reality. He glanced toward me, then quickly looked away. Of course, sir. His voice was barely above a whisper. The call ended. Nobody spoke. Even Genevieve looked uncomfortable now. Alistair lowered the phone slowly. What happened? She asked. He didn't answer. Alistair, still nothing. I finally set my glass down. What did he want? Alistair looked at me. For the first time in years, he seemed unsure how to speak to me. There is a board meeting tomorrow. I nodded. Right. It wasn't scheduled. Right. He hesitated. The CEO asked me a question. I remained silent. Alistair looked directly into my eyes. He asked if I understood who my wife was. The room became very quiet. Genevieve shifted uneasily in her chair. "What does that even mean?" she asked. Neither of us answered. Because deep down, Alistair already knew. He simply hadn't connected all the pieces yet. Without another word, he grabbed his laptop and walked into his home office. Genevieve remained awkwardly seated at the dining table. The mistress, who had arrived, feeling superior, suddenly looked like someone who wanted to leave. I stood and began collecting dishes. She watched me nervously. "Aren't you upset?" she finally asked. I looked at her. "I think you're confusing calm with weakness." She looked away first. About 20 minutes later, Alistair emerged from his office. He looked like a completely different man. His face had gone pale, his eyes were bloodshot, and all traces of arrogance had disappeared. "What did you find?" I asked. His voice cracked slightly. "Your father?" I didn't respond. Alistair continued. "Reginald Sterling?" Still silence. "I thought he owned a few investment firms." I almost laughed. That was what most people thought. My father preferred it that way. Alistair stared at me. "Why didn't you tell me?" There it was. Not an apology, not regret, not concern for our marriage. The first question he asked was why he hadn't known. As if the real problem was being left out of valuable information. I folded my arms. "You never asked." His jaw tightened. "Cordelia? No." I shook my head. "You spent years telling me what kind of family mattered and what kind didn't. You never once cared enough to learn about mine." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Genevieve stood. "I think I should go." Nobody stopped her. Alistair didn't even look at her. That alone told me everything. The fantasy had already started collapsing. The moment he realized who I actually was, Genevieve became irrelevant. She quietly grabbed her handbag and left. The front door closed. Then it was just the two of us, a married couple sitting among half-finished glasses of wine and the ruins of a life neither of us fully recognized anymore. Alistair sat down slowly. "I didn't know." I nodded. "I know." His voice grew softer. "The CEO said your father's group is reviewing several strategic commitments." I remained silent. "The board is panicking again." Silence. "Did you do this?" That question lingered in the air. I considered lying. Instead, I chose honesty. I sent a text. Alistair stared at me. "To your father?" "Yes." "And he acted immediately." I shook my head. "No." That answer confused him. Because the truth was more complicated. My father and I had established that signal years ago. Not because we planned to destroy people. Because he wanted to know when I had finally reached my limit. "There is a difference. A very important difference." I explained it calmly. When my father received that message, he didn't attack anyone. Alistair listened. He knew I had exhausted every option. I paused. He knew something serious had happened. Alistair lowered his eyes. For the first time all evening, shame appeared on his face. Real shame. Not fear. Not panic. Shame. Unfortunately, it had arrived years too late. Around midnight, my mobile rang. It was my father. I stepped outside onto the back patio to answer. The night air felt cool against my skin. "You all right?" he asked. His voice sounded calm, steady, exactly as it always had. I suddenly felt 10 years old again. Not really. I figured. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed. "I warned you." "You did. I hoped I was wrong." "So did I." The silence that followed felt strangely comforting. Finally, he spoke again. "I didn't pull anything." I smiled. "I know." I called the CEO. That sounded much more like my father. "What did you tell him?" "The truth." "And what was that?" His voice hardened. "That a man representing their institution had just humiliated my daughter in her own home." I closed my eyes. For the first time all evening, I felt tears threatening to surface. Not because I was heartbroken, because someone had finally acknowledged how wrong it all was. My father continued. "The rest is up to them." That distinction mattered. He wasn't demanding revenge. He wasn't threatening the bank. He was simply refusing to ignore what had happened. And now Alistair would have to face the consequences of his own actions. Not mine. Not my father's. His. When I returned inside, Alistair was sitting alone in the dark sitting room. The arrogance was gone. The excuses were gone. Even the anger was gone. For the first time since I had known him, he looked small. "Cordelia," he said quietly. I stopped walking. "I'm sorry." The words finally came, but they felt strangely empty, because apologies matter most before someone gets caught, not after. I looked at the man I had loved for 12 years. Then I realized something important. I no longer wanted revenge. What I wanted was freedom. And somehow that realization frightened Alistair far more than my father's influence ever could. The following morning, Alistair left the house before sunrise. I heard him moving around upstairs around 5:30, opening and closing drawers, changing ties twice, and pacing across the bedroom floor. The man who normally walked into every meeting with effortless confidence suddenly seemed unable to decide which shirt to wear. I remained in bed, not because I was asleep, because I had nothing to say. Eventually, he appeared in the doorway. For a moment, he simply stood there watching me, waiting, maybe hoping I would stop him, maybe hoping I would offer reassurance. Instead, I quietly sipped my tea. "Cordelia," I looked up. "What?" His shoulders sagged slightly. "I don't know what's going to happen today." I nodded. Neither of us mentioned that I probably knew more than he did. After a long pause, he finally left. The front door closed. The house became silent. And for the first time in years, I felt something unexpected. Peace. Not happiness, not satisfaction, just peace. The kind that arrives when you finally stop fighting a battle you've already lost. I spent the morning working from home. Emails, client calls, reports, normal life. Yet every few minutes, my mind drifted back to Alistair. I wasn't worried about his career. I was thinking about the man I had married. The man who once drove 4 hours through a snowstorm because I was ill. The man who once spent an entire weekend helping my mother repaint her kitchen. The man who used to make me laugh so hard I couldn't breathe. Where had that version of him gone? Had success changed him, or had success simply revealed who he always was? Around 10:30, my mobile buzzed. "Dad, how's the apocalypse?" I asked. He laughed, disappointingly civilized. That sounded about right. My father had spent 40 years navigating boardrooms, mergers, and negotiations. He understood something many people didn't. Real power rarely shouted. It simply changed the direction of a room. "What happened?" I asked. "The board is asking questions about Alistair, about judgment." That answer intrigued me. Dad continued. "The issue isn't that he had an affair." I frowned. No. His voice remained calm. "The issue is that he displayed terrible judgment while representing an institution that depends on trust." That was a very banking world answer. And also a very accurate one. Banks didn't panic over broken marriages. They panicked over leadership concerns. If someone demonstrated arrogance, recklessness, or poor decision-making in one area of life, executives naturally wondered where else those flaws existed. Dad paused. "By the way." "What?" The CEO was angry. That surprised me. At Alistair? No. I waited. At himself. Why? Because nobody noticed this sooner. I thought about that for a moment. Then I understood. Alistair hadn't become arrogant overnight. People had simply tolerated it because he delivered results. Now that the spotlight had shifted, behaviors everyone ignored suddenly looked different. Around noon, Alistair finally called. I almost didn't answer. Eventually I did. "Hello." His voice sounded exhausted. "Can we talk?" "We're talking." A long silence followed. The meeting was bad. I leaned back in my chair. "How bad?" Another pause. "Nobody mentioned the affair." "Interesting. What did they mention?" "My judgment." There it was again. The same word. Judgment. Alistair exhaled heavily. "They reviewed client complaints." My eyebrows lifted. "What complaints?" "Small things." The way he said it immediately told me they weren't small. People often describe serious problems as small when they're desperate. He continued. "Comments I made." My stomach tightened. Over the years, I had heard enough of those comments myself. The condescending remarks, the subtle insults, the obsession with status. Apparently, clients had noticed too. "Anything else?" I asked. Alistair laughed bitterly. It wasn't a happy sound. They reviewed employee feedback. That explained everything. People who fear powerful colleagues rarely speak up. But once leadership starts asking questions, stories emerge quickly. Years of stories, years of observations, years of concerns. Alistair was finally hearing what everyone else had been seeing. The conversation ended shortly afterward, and for the first time, I began to understand where this was heading. Not toward revenge, toward accountability. Those two things sometimes look similar from a distance, but they are very different. 3 days later, the situation became worse. For Alistair, much worse. The bank announced an internal leadership review. Officially, it had nothing to do with him. Unofficially, everyone knew exactly why it was happening. His colleagues began treating him differently. People who once invited him to private dinners suddenly stopped calling. Coworkers who used to laugh at his jokes became distant. One executive even canceled a golf weekend they had planned for months. Alistair had spent years building a network based on influence. Now he was discovering how fragile influence could be. One evening, he arrived home looking completely defeated. I was reading in the sitting room. He sat across from me. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. Genevieve left. I turned a page. Right. His expression twisted slightly. That's all you're going to say. I looked up. What would you like me to say? He looked away. Nothing. Because there was nothing to say. Genevieve had entered the relationship believing Alistair was a rising star. The moment his future became uncertain, she disappeared. The irony was impossible to ignore. For years, Alistair had measured people by status. Then someone measured him the same way, and he hated it. The following week brought another blow. A major promotion he had expected for months suddenly disappeared. No explanation, no announcement, just gone. Someone else received it. Someone with a cleaner reputation, someone leadership trusted more. That night, Alistair sat alone at the kitchen table long after midnight. I found him staring into a glass of whiskey. I worked 10 years for that promotion. His voice sounded hollow. I sat down across from him. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to sympathy. Not because he deserved rescue, because pain is still pain, even when it's self-inflicted. Alistair looked up. Do you know what's killing me? I didn't answer. It's not losing the promotion. His eyes filled with regret. It's realizing that everyone saw what I became except me. That was probably the most honest thing he had said in years. The tragedy wasn't that Alistair had made one terrible decision. The tragedy was that he had slowly become someone capable of making it, one compromise at a time, one arrogant comment at a time, one selfish choice at a time, until eventually he couldn't recognize himself anymore. Neither could I. As the weeks passed, his professional reputation continued to erode. Nothing catastrophic happened. No dramatic firing. No public scandal. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, opportunities quietly disappeared. Trust quietly vanished. Respect quietly eroded. And those losses proved far more painful than a single dramatic collapse ever could have been. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened to me. I started feeling stronger. Not because Alistair was suffering, because I finally stopped organizing my life around his approval. I started seeing friends more often. I accepted speaking opportunities I had previously declined. I laughed again. The woman I had been before years of constant criticism slowly began returning. And the more she returned, the more obvious one truth became. My marriage wasn't broken because of Genevieve. Genevieve was simply the final symptom. The real damage had started years earlier. The affair had only exposed it. One rainy evening, Alistair came home and found me reviewing flat listings. He froze. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly asked the question he had been avoiding for weeks. Are you leaving? I met his eyes, and for the first time, I answered, honestly, yes. The words seemed to hit Alistair harder than any board meeting, any lost promotion, or any difficult conversation with his superiors. Yes, just 3 letters. Yet, the moment I said it, something changed in his face. Not shock. He had seen this coming, not anger. That had burned out weeks ago. What I saw was grief. The kind people experience when denial finally runs out of places to hide. You're serious? I closed my laptop. Yes. Alistair stared at the flat listings visible on the screen. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he laughed quietly. Not because anything was funny. Because sometimes people laugh when reality becomes too painful. I kept telling myself you'd calm down. I folded my hands. This isn't about being angry. I know. That was the problem. If I were furious, perhaps there would still be a fight left to have. But I wasn't. I was tired. Tired in a way that went deeper than emotion. 12 years of marriage had taught me something difficult. Love can survive mistakes. It can survive hardship. It can even survive betrayal under certain circumstances. But respect is different. Once respect dies, everything else eventually follows. Alistair understood that. Now, unfortunately, understanding something after you've destroyed it doesn't bring it back. The following week, I signed a lease on a central London flat. Nothing extravagant, just a quiet place overlooking the River Thames, a place that felt like mine. When I moved out, Alistair helped carry boxes. The situation felt strangely surreal. There were no screaming arguments, no dramatic confrontations, just two people transporting the remains of a shared life into separate futures. At one point, he carried a box of old photo albums to my car. He looked down at the label, Holidays. For several seconds, he simply stared. Then he asked quietly, "Do you remember our trip to Cornwall?" I nodded. Of course I remembered. We had spent a week driving along the coast, eating pasties and arguing about which lighthouse was the most beautiful. Back then, we had been happy. Or at least I thought we were. Alistair smiled sadly. I used to think those memories would always protect us. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. So did I. Neither of us spoke again. Some conversations arrived years too late. This was one of them. 3 weeks after I moved out, Alistair's internal review finally concluded. The bank didn't fire him. In many ways, what happened was worse. He was removed from several leadership tracks, reassigned to a less influential role, and informed that future advancement would depend on rebuilding trust. The message was clear. His career wasn't over, but the future he had imagined was gone. The executive office he dreamed about gone. The fast-track promotion gone. The reputation he had spent years constructing, damaged, perhaps permanently. When he called to tell me, his voice sounded exhausted. They didn't destroy me. No, they just stopped believing in me. That sentence stayed with me long after the call ended, because trust works that way. It takes years to build, minutes to lose, and sometimes a lifetime to rebuild. Around the same time, Genevieve disappeared completely from his life. Not dramatically, no confrontation, no public scene. She simply stopped answering calls, stopped responding to messages, stopped pretending. One afternoon, I ran into an acquaintance from Alistair's social circle. Over coffee, she mentioned that Genevieve had recently started dating a venture capitalist from Mayfair. I wasn't surprised. Neither apparently was anyone else. The relationship had always been transactional. Once the transaction lost value, it ended. Ironically, Alistair now understood exactly how it felt to be valued only for status. For years, he had judged people according to what they could offer. Now he was experiencing the same judgment from the other side. Life has a way of teaching lessons in the language people understand best. Meanwhile, my own life continued moving forward. For the first time in years, I stopped shrinking myself, stopped downplaying my accomplishments, stopped apologizing for existing. I accepted an invitation to join the board of a financial literacy charity. I expanded my consulting work. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen regularly in years. One Saturday afternoon, I met my father for lunch. We sat outside at a restaurant overlooking the Serpentine. The weather was perfect. Small boats drifted across the water. Families walked along the shoreline. For a while, neither of us discussed Alistair. Eventually, Dad broke the silence. "You look better." I smiled. "Thanks." "You do." He studied me carefully. "You're standing differently." I laughed. "What does that mean?" "It means you're carrying less weight." At first, I assumed he meant stress. Then I realized he meant something else. Years of criticism. Years of walking on eggshells. Years of quietly accepting treatment I didn't deserve. Those things weigh more than people realize. Dad sipped his coffee. "I want you to know something." "What?" I never wanted to be right. I looked at him. He continued, "When I warned you about Alistair, I wasn't hoping he'd fail. I know. I hoped he'd prove me wrong. For some reason, that nearly made me cry because it reminded me that none of this had started as a revenge story. It started as a love story, a failed one, a tragic one, but still a love story. People sometimes forget that. They see the ending and assume the pain was worth it. It wasn't. No amount of satisfaction can completely erase disappointment. The following month brought another turning point. Alistair asked if we could meet. Not to reconcile, not to negotiate, just to talk. After some hesitation, I agreed. We met at a quiet coffee shop near Regent's Park. He looked older, not physically, emotionally. The confidence that once dominated every room had softened into something more thoughtful, more human. After we sat down, neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, Alistair said, "I blamed everyone." I waited. The bank pause. My coworkers. Another pause. Your father. He looked down at his coffee. Even you. Then he sighed. But it wasn't them. For the first time, I believed him. Not because he sounded convincing, because he sounded exhausted. Exhausted from lying to himself. I did this. The words landed heavily between us. Simple, undeniable, true. And sometimes truth is the first step toward becoming someone better. Unfortunately, it doesn't erase consequences. As we left the coffee shop, Alistair stopped beside the door. "Cordelia, yes." His voice grew quiet. "I think losing you finally forced me to see myself." I didn't answer immediately. Then I nodded because despite everything, I believed he meant it. And that realization hurt almost as much as the betrayal itself because growth had finally arrived. Just not in time. By the time our divorce proceedings officially began, nearly 6 months had passed since the night Alistair brought Genevieve into our home. 6 months. Strange how a life can unravel so quickly after taking years to build. People imagine divorce as a war. At least that's how television portrays it. Explosive arguments, greedy demands, lawyers attacking each other across conference tables. Our reality was quieter, and somehow that made it sadder. There were no battles over money, no hidden accounts, no vicious custody fight. We didn't have children, and the financial issues were relatively straightforward. The hardest thing to divide wasn't property. It was history. Every document we signed felt like another chapter being officially closed. One Tuesday morning, I sat across from Alistair in a mediation office overlooking the city of London. The room was professional and neutral. Gray walls, large windows, a long conference table, the kind of place designed to keep emotions under control. It wasn't working. Not entirely. Because every time I looked at Alistair, memories surfaced. Good ones, bad ones, everything in between. The mediator explained procedures. Lawyers reviewed paperwork. Pens moved across pages. Yet beneath all the legal language, one painful reality remained. 2 people who once planned a future together were now negotiating an ending. At one point, the mediator stepped out to make copies. The lawyers followed. For the first time that morning, Alistair and I were alone. The silence stretched. Then he spoke. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded. "When did you stop loving me?" The question caught me off guard. Not because it was difficult, because it wasn't. I looked at him carefully. I didn't. His eyebrows lifted. I continued. "Love wasn't the first thing I lost." The room remained silent. "What was I took a deep breath, trust?" Alistair lowered his eyes. A moment later, I added, "and respect." Neither of us spoke after that because there wasn't really anything to argue with. The truth rarely requires debate. Later that afternoon, while reviewing financial disclosures, another realization struck me. For years, Alistair had chased status, the bigger title, the better office, the wealthier social circles, the appearance of success. And now, sitting in that conference room, none of those things mattered. Not one. The things that mattered were honesty, character, loyalty, the very qualities he had sacrificed along the way. The irony felt almost cruel. A few weeks later, the divorce moved closer to completion. Friends began asking questions. Some were curious, others genuinely cared. Most wanted to know the same thing. Was I angry? The answer surprised them. Not really. Anger had been useful at first. It gave me energy, direction, momentum, but eventually anger becomes heavy, and I was tired of carrying it. That didn't mean Alistair deserved forgiveness. Not yet. It simply meant I deserved peace. One evening, I shared that thought with my father during dinner. We were sitting in his kitchen eating homemade pasta while rain tapped gently against the windows. Dad listened quietly. Then he nodded. That's healthy, I smiled. Coming from you, that's unexpected. He laughed. What? You think I spend my life plotting revenge? A little. That earned another laugh. Then his expression softened. Cordelia, what? The goal was never punishment. I knew that. Still hearing it mattered, Dad continued. The goal was protecting you. There it was again. The distinction that had shaped everything. From the beginning, he hadn't acted because Alistair embarrassed him or because he wanted power. He acted because his daughter finally sent a signal she promised she'd never send unless she had no other choice. That difference mattered a lot. Several days later, Alistair called unexpectedly. His voice sounded nervous. Can we meet one more time? I hesitated. For what? I need to say something. Part of me wanted to refuse. Another part knew I would regret never hearing him out, so I agreed. We met at a small park near the River Thames. The weather had finally begun warming up. Children played nearby. Joggers passed along the trail. Ordinary life continued around us. Alistair arrived carrying 2 coffees, one exactly the way I used to order it. Some habits survive even after relationships end. We sat on a bench overlooking the water. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then he finally broke the silence. I owe you an apology. I looked at him. You've apologized before. I know. His hands tightened around the coffee cup. But those were apologies from someone afraid of consequences. That got my attention, he continued. This one is different. The sincerity in his voice felt unmistakable. Alistair stared out toward the river. When everything started falling apart, I thought I was the victim. He laughed bitterly. I actually convinced myself your father ruined my career. I remained silent. I blamed everyone. He shook his head. Then one day I realized something. What? His eyes met mine. Nobody forced me to become that person. The words hung in the air. Simple, honest, painful. I did that. I believed him. Not because I wanted to, because responsibility sounded different from self-pity. And for the first time in a very long time, Alistair wasn't asking for sympathy. He was accepting ownership. After a long pause, he spoke again. The worst part isn't losing the promotion. I waited. It isn't losing Genevieve. Another pause. It isn't even the divorce. His voice grew quieter. The worst part is realizing that I had someone who genuinely loved me. And I treated her like she wasn't enough. For several seconds, neither of us moved. I felt sadness, not triumph, not satisfaction, sadness. Because there was truth in what he said, and because truth arriving too late can be heartbreaking. Eventually, I stood. Alistair remained seated. I knew what he wanted. Not reconciliation, not another chance, something smaller, something simpler. Hope. The hope that one day he might be forgiven. I looked down at him. I don't hate you. Relief flickered across his face. Then I added, but forgiveness and trust aren't the same thing. He nodded slowly. I know. And for the first time, I believed he actually did. 3 weeks later, the divorce became official. One judge, a few signatures, less than an hour, 12 years reduced to paperwork. As I walked out of the courthouse, I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I felt free. There is a difference. Victory depends on someone else's defeat. Freedom doesn't. Freedom simply means you no longer need permission to move forward. For the first time in years, my future belonged entirely to me. And that felt better than revenge ever could. A year after the divorce, I found myself standing in front of a ballroom filled with nearly 300 people. Business leaders, educators, community organizers, university students, retirees, people from every background imaginable. The event was a fundraising gala supporting financial literacy programs across England, and somehow I had become the guest speaker. If someone had told me that 2 years earlier, I would have laughed. Back then, I spent so much energy trying to keep my marriage together that I barely thought about my own future. Now, things were different. Not perfect, different, and different was enough. The charity board I joined had expanded its programs significantly. We were helping working families understand budgeting, debt management, homeownership, and long-term financial planning. The work felt meaningful, real, unlike the status games that had consumed so much of Alistair's world. As I stood backstage waiting to speak, my father approached. At 72, Reginald Sterling still carried himself with the quiet confidence that had made him successful for decades. He adjusted his tie and smiled, nervous a little. Good. I laughed. Good. It means you care. That was classic Dad. Simple, direct, usually right. He glanced toward the audience. You've built something important. So did you. He shook his head. No. Then he pointed toward the ballroom. I built companies. His expression softened. You help people. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then the event coordinator signaled that it was time. As I walked toward the stage, I felt something unexpected. Gratitude. Not for what happened. I would never be grateful for the betrayal, but grateful for what came afterward, for the chance to rebuild, for the lessons I learned, for the person I became. The speech went well. People applauded. Several students approached afterward to thank me. One young woman told me she was the first person in her family to attend university. Another said our scholarship program had changed her life. Those conversations stayed with me far longer than any applause because, unlike status influencer titles, they actually mattered. The evening was winding down when I saw a familiar face near the back of the room. Addy stare. For a moment, I wondered if I was imagining things. Then he smiled politely and raised a hand. He looked different. Not older. Lighter. The expensive arrogance that once surrounded him seemed gone. His suit was nice but modest. His posture relaxed, his eyes clearer, and strangely enough, he looked more like the man I originally married than the executive he later became. When the crowd began thinning out, he approached. Congratulations. Thank you. He glanced around the room. You've done something remarkable. The compliment sounded genuine. I appreciated that. We walked toward a quieter corner near the windows overlooking the city. For a few moments, we simply watched the lights below. London looked beautiful at night, busy, alive, full of possibilities. Finally, Alistair broke the silence. I wasn't sure if I should come. Why did you? He smiled faintly. Because I wanted to see how your story turned out. I considered that. Then I shook my head. It isn't over yet. Fair point. We both laughed softly. The conversation felt surprisingly comfortable, not because the past had disappeared, because enough time had passed for both of us to see it clearly. Alistair leaned against the window. I'm working at a smaller firm now. How do you like it? His smile widened. Honestly, I nodded. A lot more than I expected. That surprised me. He explained that the company focused on community lending and small business development. The work wasn't glamorous. The pay wasn't extraordinary, but he found it meaningful. Imagine that, meaningful. Years earlier, Alistair would have considered that word irrelevant. Now it seemed important. Life has a way of changing priorities. After a pause, he looked at me. I owe you one more thank you. I raised an eyebrow. For what? His expression grew serious. For not destroying me. The comment caught me off guard. I thought about it for a moment, then I shook my head. I didn't save you either. No. He smiled sadly. You just stopped protecting me from myself. That was probably closer to the truth. For years I had excused things, minimized them, rationalized them. The night I sent that text, all of that ended, not because I wanted revenge, because I finally accepted reality. Alistair stared out the window. You know, I used to hate that sentence. What sentence? He laughed quietly. Know your place? The words hung between us. The same words that had shattered our marriage. The same words that had revealed exactly who he had become. Alistair shook his head. I thought about them for months. I remained silent. Then he continued. The funny thing is, I was the one who needed to learn my place. I couldn't help smiling. There was wisdom in that. The kind earned through failure. The kind nobody can teach you. For several moments, we stood together in comfortable silence. Not as husband and wife. Not as enemies. Just two people who had shared part of a journey. Eventually, Alistair turned toward me. I'm sorry. The words were simple. No speeches, no excuses, no conditions, just sorry. This time, I accepted them. Not because they erased anything, because they didn't, but because carrying resentment no longer served either of us. I know. Relief crossed his face. Then he nodded. Goodbye, Cordelia. Goodbye, Alistair. He walked away, and I watched him disappear into the crowd. That was the last time I ever saw him, at least so far. As the evening came to an end, I found my father waiting near the exit. Together we stepped outside into the cool London night. The city lights reflected across the river. Traffic moved steadily through the streets below. Life continued as it always does. Dad glanced at me. You okay? I smiled. Yeah. He studied me for a second. Then he smiled too. The drive home felt peaceful, not because everything had worked out perfectly. It hadn't. Some wounds leave scars, some losses never completely disappear. But healing isn't about pretending the pain never happened. It's about refusing to let the pain define the rest of your life. Looking back now, people often assume the most important moment in my story was the text message. Pull funding. But they're wrong. The most important moment came later. The moment I stopped measuring my worth through someone else's eyes. The moment I realized respect cannot be begged for. It can only be recognized. And if someone repeatedly refuses to see your value, sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away. Alistair lost his marriage. He lost the future he thought he deserved. He lost the image he spent years building. But in the process, he gained something too. Self-awareness, humility, perspective. The lessons arrived painfully, but they arrived. And perhaps that was the fairest ending possible. Not destruction. Growth, not vengeance without purpose. Consequences with meaning. Because in the end, money didn't destroy our marriage. Pride did. And that's a lesson worth remembering. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to walk away from someone who refused to value you? Do you believe people can truly change after facing the consequences of their actions? Share your perspective in the comments. And if you enjoy stories that explore justice, resilience, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next journey.